Welcome to the Kyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode number 140, and I have with me here Pastor Nathan Zekveld from Grand Prairie, Alberta. We've had him on before, but the reason we're having him back is because he has just published a book called The COVID Archives. And Nathan, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again. I think last time we talked about the church is our mother, right?
We did, yes. It was an article that you wrote for Kyperian.com. That was a really good one.
Yeah. So in a ways, that topic is kind of connected into the topic for today too.
Right, because the book you wrote it's a collection of your blog posts, right? That you were publishing
Yeah.
sort of during the time of COVID. Do you want to tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I've got a book that I'm talking about here, and that's called The COVID Archives: A Pastor's Voyage Through Lockdowns and Blog Posts. And I published that, I think it was July 14 or 15 that I published it. Anyway, it's basically just a series of blog posts. I've been pastoring since 2019, 2020. I started pastoring in Prince Edward Island. And as I was pastoring and as lockdowns were hitting from like March of 2020, and then as mask mandates came in towards the end of the year, and all these new regulations were coming in, I was kind of responding to each of the new developments publicly. And so you can actually see a number of the dates when I published it. So, for example, the first one I published on April 18, 2020. And I published about, I think there's about 20 blog posts or more in this book. And it deals with all the different aspects of lockdowns. It deals with mandates. It deals with vaccines. It deals with masking, and just trying to consider from a Christian perspective, and especially from the perspective of a pastor, exactly how Christians should be responding to that and thinking through all the issues arising.
Yeah, it did. It felt like a walk down memory lane reading it. I know you're in Canada, I'm in the US, so we had different experiences in some ways, but also just remembering the way things unfolded and the order they happened in. It's hard to believe it's been 4 years ago.
Yeah. Well, we had Teresa Tam up here in Canada, but she was basically speaking all the talking points from Anthony Fauci.
Okay.
So,
Can you basically give me an outline of how your church handled COVID and sort of talk through the decisions you made really quickly, and then we can maybe talk about the content of the book?
yeah, so on Prince Edward Island, the church that I was in, we responded to lockdowns mostly by complying. And these blog posts were intended to be kind of a way of encouraging thought and conversation within the church in Atlantic Canada, because basically all the churches in Atlantic Canada shut down. You had very few that opened up. You had a few in Ontario, you had a few in Alberta, you had a few in BC. So yeah, anyway, the intent of the public blog post was to encourage conversation and to get people to think about how the Word of God speaks to and can be applied in moments like this.
Right. So I guess I didn't realize this until just now. So the church you're at right now is not the church you were in 4 years ago.
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've been up here in Grand Prairie for about 2 years now, and the Christ Covenant Church of Grand Prairie, they opened up about 6 weeks into the lockdowns. I think they spotted the lie quicker than a lot of people did.
Right.
And yeah, I think we're blessed as a result of that.
Right. I think we were similar. I'm trying to remember the exact number of weeks. It might have been 4 weeks that we did sort of a Zoom service, partly because there was the 3 weeks or however many weeks to flatten the curve, and we thought, okay, well, just a few weeks, and then this is not a huge deal, and then very quickly realized, actually, this is not ending. So yeah, we went to outdoor services and then found a location. Near the end of your book, you lay out sort of 3 options for churches in times like this. And the options you gave were obey the government, submit to the government, or rebel against the government. And in your opinion at the time, this wasn't the time to rebel yet. You know, the things could get to the point where you have to rebel against the government, but we weren't there. Uh, but you made a distinction between obeying and submitting. And I thought that was a good distinction because many people, when they say submit to your governing authorities, in their minds, that means do whatever they tell you to do. You want to talk about that a little bit, the difference between obeying and submitting?
Yeah, so that's actually something I bring up a number of times throughout the book. So like for example, the first two blog posts talk about authority.
Right.
And so I do touch on it quite a few times throughout the book. So I would say obedience is doing what they say. I would say that submitting is recognizing that they're lawfully ordained authorities, but there's also limitations on their authority and to what they can say. And so, like the apostles who said in Acts chapter 4, we must obey God and not men. I would say the apostles still took on a position of submission towards the authorities of that day, but they did not always necessarily obey, especially when the words of the civil authorities conflicted with God's authority.
In thinking about authority, and we're talking about government authority, church authority, and the Kuyperian sphere sovereignty idea, which you bring up quite a bit in the book. How do you think going through COVID affected your perspective on differing levels of authority? Did it change you at all? Did it cause you to think more deeply about some things that maybe you hadn't before? What was your experience with that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say COVID fundamentally changed any of my core beliefs. So I had grown up in a Reformed home. My dad had taught me sphere sovereignty growing up. My dad is also a Reformed pastor in the city of Toronto. And then I went to New St. Andrews College, and I feel like that was kind of the air we breathed at New St. Andrews College, and is something that's very central to the way that many CREC churches think as well. So I wouldn't say I fundamentally changed any of my ideas on sphere sovereignty over the course of COVID. I think COVID did force me to reflect very deeply on medical freedom, Christian liberty within the medical practice. And again, I already had ideas that were leaning in that direction. So, for example, I had studied up a lot on the abuses of Nazi Germany and the abuses of communist Russia, especially in the field of science. And so I already kind of was inclined in that direction. But what the COVID lockdowns did for me was I think it really deepened my reflection and really forced me to dig deep into the scriptures and to find a foundation in the Bible.
Yeah, you say in the book, science is not a sphere of authority. It's an academic discipline. It's a tool, but it's not one of the spheres of authority God has established. Why do you think we treat it like one?
Yeah, so I think it's possible that it's in part a historical trend that has moved us in this direction. So science, of course, flourishes in the last 500 years across Europe, in part as a result of the Reformation, in part as a result of freedom of thought. But then, especially in the early 1900s, you get more and more talk about public safety. You have vaccines as a preventative medicine being pushed forward. You have a lot more science being done as an arm of the state. And Kuyper actually responds to a lot of that already early in the 1900s. And it's interesting that even 100 years ago in Kuyper's works, he doesn't condemn vaccines, but he talks about the danger or the threat of mandatory vaccination.
Right.
So it's something that people have been seeing arising in a lot of the modern state tyrannies.
Do you think to some extent, this is something I was thinking when I was reading it, do you think it's possible that relying on science as the authority allows politicians to shirk personal responsibility for whatever might happen under their watch. So rather than saying, I'm responsible, I'm making decisions, and I'm going to do what I think is wise, they can say, oh, this isn't my decision. Science says I'm just doing science. Whatever science tells me, don't blame me, blame science. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, I don't. I think it definitely arose over the course of COVID that it started being used that way, and was probably even used early on that way. And basically every time I would try to communicate with my elected officials, like I didn't elect any of the doctors
Right.
to lead the situation through COVID. But anytime I talked to my elected officials, they would always say, "Well, go talk to one of the health officers." And then I talked to the health officer, and they'd say, "Well, go talk to your elected official." So there was constantly you couldn't really pin down where the problem was coming from.
Right. You would agree that those doctors and health officials should have an advisory role, right? In making those decisions.
Yeah, I think there is a valuable place for doctors giving advice at times, but there should be a variety of opinions, and I, I think most doctors would never use the word dogma in the
Right.
context of their medical practice, but I think in some ways the decisions of the chief health officers almost became dogma during COVID.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
What do you think the misuse of authority by governing officials and sometimes, as you point out, even by church authorities during COVID, what do you think that's done overall for the average citizen, the average layman in the church, their perception of authority or their attitude toward authority?
Yeah, so I think what it's done is it's created a lot of distrust for authority, and you see that both increasingly in the church as well as in the state. I do also see certain church leaders who tried to stay faithful, as well as certain political leaders who tried to stay committed to uh, solid principle. I do see them maintaining a certain level of credibility, but it has overall created a lot of chaos, and it's going to take time to restore some of the trust that was lost over COVID.
Right. How do you go about doing that? Um, if your church was shut down for the long haul, and maybe you come to the realization that we made the wrong choice. We shouldn't have done that. We should have opened up quickly. How do you rebuild that trust, or do you think it's even possible at that point?
So I do think it is possible. I know some people would disagree with me, but I do think it is possible to rebuild that trust. And I think a lot of the rebuilding of that trust uh, begins by just really focusing on what God's word has to say, focusing on the truths, recognizing that yeah, some people were duped, and the people who were duped for a long time, maybe they have more culpability, and maybe apologies need to be said. But I think the biggest goal is to focus on saying this is what's true. And so what I isolate in this book is the modern church in large should recognize that first of all, the lordship of Christ was compromised, or our belief in the lordship of Christ was compromised, and then also our belief in Christian liberty was compromised. So if we can agree on that, I do think that there is a way to move forward, and people will have to determine within their local situations what apologies need to be said, etc. Because I think everybody is motivated by different motivations. Um, and yeah, it becomes quite a complex issue with how to move forward, or it can be.
Yeah, and you devote kind of an entire chapter on this in your book, the pursuit of reconciliation
Yeah.
in the wake of COVID lockdowns, because that is a major fallout that's happened since COVID. You do see that erosion of authority, and I've seen even in the wake of it, mostly online. I haven't seen it in my own personal context, but I've seen online, especially, sort of a strong anti-clerical it seems like, attitude or movement, where, for a lot of people, the pastor has overstepped his authority. What he should do is preach a Bible chapter on Sunday morning, and that's all the authority he has. He's got no other authority. The elders don't have any other authority, and he almost becomes I don't really know how to say it, but almost kind of the church pet. Like, we humor him by listening to him on Sunday morning, but that's all the authority we're going to give him. I've seen that attitude creeping into a lot of online discourse, it seems like. And so I think thinking about that, how to move forward, and principles of reconciliation are good. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one thing you bring up in your book. You have a chapter dedicated to this, and I thought it was interesting because I have heard this kind of rhetoric when COVID was happening and people said the church is being persecuted. And then you have people saying, well, no, you're not being persecuted as a Christian. Everybody is being forced to shut down. Everybody's being forced to distance. It's not targeting pastors. It's not targeting churches specifically. And therefore, it's not persecution for your faith. And you wrote a chapter called Is the Chinese church persecuted, or is the church in China persecuted? Which I thought was really great. Do you want to talk about that just a little bit? Like, how would that sort of same kind of argumentation, how could it be used to argue that the Chinese church is not persecuted?
Yeah, so I've actually heard it proposed in the last couple of years that Wang Yi is not actually being persecuted,
Oh,
and
okay.
that yeah,
I had
yeah,
not.
and
I thought
that's
you were just making an analogy. I didn't know that there were people actually saying that. So, whoa, that's different.
well, yeah. So the funny thing
Yeah.
is, I made the analogy, and then I heard somebody actually suggest that.
Wow.
Um, so yeah. Anyway, so Wang Yi, of course, he in China, you can basically avoid persecution by flying under the radar. Yeah, they might still persecute you, but you can avoid a lot of attention by flying under the radar by keeping your congregation under 50 people. Um, and I know in Canada, some churches were taking tips from China saying, well, maybe we just need to maintain number limits so that we can escape the government scrutiny, et cetera. But I truly do believe that Wang Yi is suffering for the name of Christ, and persecution happens and it plays out in real time. And so, what I talk about in that chapter is how it's within the context or the framework of tyranny that the church begins to be persecuted, because we are a people who've been identified by freedom, as we see in 1 Peter 2, verse 15. And so, a Christian people who are living as people who are free to serve and obey and love God are going to be persecuted within that framework of tyranny. And you see that throughout every tyranny throughout world history. And yeah, the church is free to serve or ought to be free to serve and worship God. And so you see that in the case of Wang Yi, you see that in the case of persecution in the Middle East.
Right. And almost never in this life, if you're thinking about Christian persecution, you're almost never going to be persecuted for being a Christian. If you're looking for the exact phraseology, well, you're not persecuted by that standard. The very, very early church in Acts is persecuted by the Jewish leaders for believing in Jesus. There's
Yeah.
you could say there it is. But when the Romans started persecuting the Christians, it wasn't for believing in Jesus. It was because you're a bad citizen. You don't come to the festivals. You don't come, do your civic duty. You don't sacrifice your pinch of incense to Caesar. Therefore, you're a hater of mankind because you don't want to see your city flourishing. And it was never, we're killing you because you believe in Jesus. It was, we're killing you for being an atheist and a hater of humanity. And so if you're waiting for the government to say, we're persecuting you for being a Christian, you're never going to hear that.
Yeah.
So it's good. So what would you say qualifies as Christian persecution then? How do we know if we're being persecuted as Christians?
Yeah, so I would say that, well, definitely persecution for testifying to the name of Christ, to the lordship of Christ, to the exclusivity of Christ among all the other beliefs. That's persecution. But so Jesus says, "Blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake." So that's also persecution for obeying Christ and seeking to uh, obey him in real time, not just in your head, but also with your hands.
Right. So that could be protesting at an abortion clinic. Some
Yeah,
people in England are arrested for that. That's for the sake of righteousness, right?
yeah,
Or things
yeah.
of
So
that
I,
nature.
growing up, I knew a lady from one of the Canadian Reformed churches in Ontario, and I think she was arrested for protesting at an abortion clinic, and she right away faced the accusation that she wasn't actually being persecuted because she stepped over the line.
Mm,
And yeah, we just have to stand with um, old ladies like that who suffer for the name of Christ.
right. So
So
from where you are right now, looking back retrospect on COVID, do you think the church in your area, the Canadian church, is better prepared for government overreach again in the future, about the same, or worse off than it was before?
yeah, so well, it's been interesting to watch how things have developed in the Canadian church over COVID. I would say that before COVID, we were a very passive church by and large. Like just looking at the overarching Canadian church, it was often said to me during COVID, "Well, we're Canadians, so we don't fight back like Americans do, right?"
Right.
And I'm like, well, regardless of whether we're Canadian or American, we still have to be obedient to Christ. Um, so I've actually seen in the Canadian church, there's definitely been a grassroots, I guess you could describe it as a grassroots movement of Christians saying, hey, you know what? Look at how much ground we've lost over the last 25 to 50 years of passivity. We need to be thinking more about what our obedience to Christ looks like. I think COVID drove a lot of Christians I know back into reading their Bibles again and to back into thinking of how important the worship of the church is. Now, that created a lot of division. So I think the division that was manifested within so many different churches across Canada and even within denominations, I don't think that's been healthy for the church. But you've definitely seen other churches pull together. So, for example, my church here in Grand Prairie has, I think, was really and truly blessed as a result of the COVID lockdowns and how their elders took leadership in the midst of COVID.
Right. And I've seen the shakeup, and I've talked about this on the podcast here with other people before, but even in my area, the churches that stayed locked down lost people. Just ordinary people who they want to go to church and they found other churches. And I've seen two or three good conservative Bible teaching churches in my area just swell and grow enormously, because people are looking uh, for a church that's open. And this has been 4 years ago, but I think that event is still reverberating down the line. People want to find those faithful churches. It's kind of like the moth joke. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
heard what are you doing here, moth? You need to be at a psychiatrist. Oh, well, the light was on. What are you doing at our church? We're Reformed Presbyterians with all this doctrine, and you're like an Arminian Baptist guy. Well, the door was open, so here we are. And so, I've seen that sort of shakeup that's probably left conservative churches, at least, in a much better place as far as understanding the importance of worship, helping the
Yeah.
average person see that as well. And I would say my beliefs didn't change radically during COVID, but I think as far as priorities, I learned a lot in terms of, well, what is the priority when things like this happen, something that I'd never thought about happening beforehand? What do you do? You dedicate a chapter to Richard Baxter, and I think that's interesting because when our session was first thinking about lockdowns, we were doing a lot of reading and a lot of discussing those first couple weeks. And those passages from Baxter, where Richard Baxter in his day was talking about how it's acceptable for the civil magistrate to tell churches not to meet in times of plague. You don't want people to die. And you
Yeah.
interact with that a little bit, uh, which is good. How would you respond to someone who says, see, churches should have just obeyed the government? Richard Baxter? Reformed tradition here. Great man. We like his books. How would you respond to someone saying, "Well, he was right. We should have just gone along"?
Yeah, so yeah, I think in my second to last chapter, I talked a little bit about what he has said, and I think my response to that would be just remembering some of the talking points as well in that blog post is so Richard Baxter, of course, was living in England during a time where many of the authorities were Christian, or at least culturally Christian, and he was also living during a time where that disease, the Black Plague, was a very vicious and deadly disease. So I think he's reflecting from a certain time in history with a certain perspective on the deadliness of a virus.
Right.
But you see with modern standards of cleanliness that viruses are not nearly as dangerous as they were at that time. And you also see with Abraham Kuyper, for example, in the early 1900s with the Spanish flu, which again was not as deadly as the Black Plague, from my understanding of it. Yet, nevertheless, I think he saw the growing trend in the West where it was becoming easier and easier for governing authorities to hinder the church from her worship by claiming that there's a public safety or a public health crisis. And you actually see Abraham Kuyper talking about that in these books. So I would just simply say Baxter was a different time.
Right.
I do believe that the state has a certain level of authority, but when we see a virus that deadly, we're going to right away be like, okay, the state doesn't even have to tell us to lock down. This is super dangerous. We should be much more careful.
Right. And some churches historically did shut down even during the Spanish flu
That's
in the
right.
early 20th century, which was pretty bad. I remember when our church was when we, the elders, were thinking about this, we were looking at the numbers and it was 4 to 5% death rate. It was what they were telling us in March of 2020 for COVID. And so we're running the numbers. Okay, that means we're gonna have, like 7 people in our church die from this if we don't shut down. Oh no, we don't want that to happen. And and then it became really quickly apparent that these are not real numbers. These projections are not anywhere near what's actually happening. And so, I guess hindsight's 2020, right? You realize maybe I don't trust projections from, when there aren't opposing voices, when you're only getting one voice, and then pretty soon you started hearing opposing voices after that, and we realized, oh no, we're not going to stay locked down. But yeah, those are good things to deal with, and I think it is good to think about the fact that the plague was deadly. I looked up at the time, Martin Luther went through a plague at Wittenberg, and one of the things he believed was in a deadly plague, a bad plague, you could shut down your church. But he said, look at all the students and people fleeing the city for such a very minor thing. And he named the number of people that had died. And so I actually, tried to look up records on how many people would have been living in Wittenberg at the time. And the death rate was something like 12%. Based on the numbers he gave of people, this many people have died. Okay, out of the city, that's like 12% of the people who get it are dying. And he was saying, this is very minor. We don't need to shut down church for this. So it is a matter of
Yeah.
perspective.
Well, yeah, and you see that with both Luther and Farel. Like I think Farel began his ministry in the middle of uh, uh, a bunch of Black Plague deaths happening, and both of them
Right.
saw the need to risk their own lives for the sake of caring for souls.
So let me ask you this. We're coming up near the end of our time here, but um, who do you expect to read this book? Who is this book for? And who would you encourage to pick it up and read it?
Yeah, so I would say that this book was intended to be a theological record of that time. I would say that it would be a good book for Christians who want to kind of review the battle that we went through and think about faithfulness again in the future if lockdowns of another form happen. I know just recently in England, the idea of lockdowns was floated in the context of all the rioting that's been happening. So I think it's possible that they could try to push some other form of lockdowns on us again. So I think a lot of the arguments are in here. I was mainly, of course, targeting this towards especially my fellow Canadian Christians, just to encourage us to think about the compromises that happened during the last round of lockdowns and how we can be faithful in the future. But I would say that I made it available in every country because I think Australian Christians, American Christians can all learn from the arguments, even if maybe some of the circumstances were slightly different from country to country. And so I just want this book to be available in the public for the sake of thinking through these principles, through these issues in future events and scenarios where we might have to risk fines and imprisonments again.
Right. And so I hadn't heard that was even a thing that's being contemplated in England right now. It would make sense. But I think, as we were talking about, government authorities have spent a lot of their capital over the last several years and are finding it harder and harder to purchase compliance from their people. So good time to pray for peace, right? As we read about in First Timothy chapter 2, pray for your rulers and those in authority, and particularly that you can live a peaceable life. So good things to think about. Well, Nathan, thank you for being on the podcast. This has been a fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Great. And I'm going to link your book in the notes so that folks can go and check it out.